So I'm going to apologize beforehand on this episode. We had a new setup for the recording of this episode. And as I listened to it and edited it, the quality was just, something was echoey and just, I had a hard time with it. So the audio quality is not as good as we usually have, so I apologize that beforehand. You can even hear it now. We're still trying to figure out how to set things up so that we can get a better recording.
Hi, this is Jay Washburn.
And I'm Joe Modosky.
And this is Start Writing.
And this episode is Elements of the End. So a request was sent in by listener Brian Allen, and he was asking about how to end the story. And it was something he was kind of struggling with and asked if we would do an episode. He probably asked in January, and it is now that we are finally getting around to it. So, having done a bunch of research on this, I realized this is going to be a multi-part episode. So, there'll be a few sections that will present just kind of a short summary, but we'll be doing full episodes on those later on. So essential elements of climax and resolution are kind of what we're looking at here. And so there'll be overlap with what we talked about in the author's promise. And there were other episodes of structure where we talked about climax and all is lost. So those are still going to be factors. But what we're really looking at is how do we create reader satisfaction with your ending. So one of the books I read for this was by James Scott Bell. And I read the last 50 pages as part of the research for this. It's by James Scott Bell. And so he has a quote here where he's talking about what we're looking for. And he says, there is one word that sums up the feelings readers crave in an ending. It's satisfaction. The word is broad enough to include any type of ending so long as it leaves the reader in a positive emotional state about the reading experience as a whole. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And so you have to ask yourself, what does your reader want that's going to give them satisfaction? Because depending on what genre you're writing in and what kind of story you're telling, that's going to be very different.
Have you ever seen the movie Seven or know about it? Like, this is a mild spoiler warning. We won't go into details, but it ends so horrifically. It's just like devastatingly depressing.
It is.
In the conclusion. But I guess if that's the genre, anyway, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I just can't help but think of how is that satisfying to just have your...
Well, but I mean, so Seven is a horror movie, but I think if you watched it because it was pitched as a crime procedural or a thriller, then you probably were very unhappy with the ending of that movie, because that's the reason I watched it, right? They kind of pitched this police procedural mystery, and that's why I watched it. But I've seen horror movies, and the end of Seven fits with what you're going to see in a horror movie.
It's horrifying.
Yeah.
And so, it's satisfactory in that way.
And so it fit that genre. The problem was a lot of the trailers that were pitching it weren't...
Looks like a cop show.
Like a cop show. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people were kind of upset with the ending because they were pitched a different kind of story. So like one of the things we do is there are genre. So things we've got a list. We're gonna work through them. We're gonna talk about the author's promise in brief, because we do have a whole episode on that. We're talking about answering questions. We'll talk about protagonist choice. We'll talk about genre expectations. We'll talk about relationship resolutions. And so before we dig in, we're going to talk about the different types of endings you can put into a book. And we'll go very briefly into why you want that kind of ending. So the types of endings. So one is the protagonist doesn't get what he wants, but he gets what he needs. Essentially, he loses, but it's good. And so the great example here is Cars. We talked about that in our character episode, right? Lightning McQueen loses the Piston Cup. He gives it up, but he finds happiness. And the why of this type of ending is that it often teaches a moral lesson. Lightning McQueen was very materialistic and misguided in his ambitions and beliefs that what would bring him happiness. and he learns that lesson in the story, and it changes what he wants. So the next kind of story is the protagonist gets what they want and what they work towards, right? So this is just that they win. So Harry Potter defeats Voldemort, right? Like it's something he has worked towards, trained for, and prepared for, and sacrificed for. And these kind of endings are fairly common, but they don't always satisfy because you have the danger of the Deus Ex Machina. Because the Deus Ex Machina can get you this kind of happy ending, but it doesn't satisfy, right? And so, just as I mentioned with Harry Potter, there are elements that make these satisfying, which is the hard work and the sacrifice leading to that ending, as opposed to it just being heaped on them at the end. And then, of course, we have the protagonist loses, which we call a tragedy. So the protagonist doesn't get what they want, but they do get what they deserve. And again, it is teaching this kind of moral lesson to the audience. Now, these are fairly rare, right? Our particularly Western culture, where a lot of media comes from, does not really produce tragedies anymore. Ancient Greek, ancient Rome, even Shakespeare, you have a fair number of tragedies being written. But the genre, as for the most part, kind of died away. There'll be a few literary novels, but I know we were just talking about like the horrible ending of Seven, and tragedies almost evolved into horror stories. They're not. As opposed to, just being tragedies, we've pushed it further, and now they're kind of the horror genre.
Man, a tragedy is a perfect description for the end of Seven.
It's a tragedy. Yeah,
it totally is. And you feel awful, and you feel like the world's awful, kind of in a way.
Yeah.
It's a good tragedy.
The protagonist gets what they want, but it's bad. Again, this is a different kind of tragedy. And most stories don't stop here. Usually, if the protagonist gets what they want and it's bad, this is kind of just before the crisis. So, but there have been stories told this way, like, or like even it's a shorter story within a bigger story, like the story of Maleficent, recently with Angelina Jolie. There's the story of her as a child and the guy who goes on to become the king. And that's a tragedy, right? He gets what he wants, right? The king's favor. He marries the princess. He goes on to become king, but it's not good for him, right? And the story goes on so far after that you can see why it's not good for him. Because, in the moment he became king, he was probably pretty happy with himself. And then eventually all these other problems catch up to him. So, like I said, that most stories don't stop there if that's a component they use. But like I said, there have been stories told where they do stop there. And again, usually it's to teach this kind of moral lesson. And then there you have the protagonist sacrifices. The victory costs something dear to the protagonist. But it is still achieved.
That's the one I gravitate towards.
Sacrifice. So, and then you have the open-ended ending, which is, how the final events play out and their meaning is kind of unclear and the audience fills in those blanks with their own imagination. I think the most famous of those is The Great Gatsby. But I'll put a link to a list of books that have kind of done this because it's a different approach. Each of these, is a different type of ending, and there's a different reason for each of them that you'll want to do. Some of them are genre purposes, right? Like we talked about, horror tends to end in tragedy, right? That's just the nature of the genre. For whatever reason, the audience has gravitated to that kind of ending because that's usually how they end.
And a couple on this list are Life of Pi and The Giver.
Yeah, Life of Pi is
whoa, that's crazy.
Ambiguous there. Same with The Giver. Yeah, so, they do serve a purpose. But like I said, we're going to go into each of these and we'll talk about cliffhanger endings in books, and epilogue endings and the unexpected twist, like Fight Club. So we'll do an episode on all of these and really dig in deep. We'll get you some good examples, from movies or television. So you can do a quick study if you need to. And then, really look at why that ending is satisfying in that type of story.
So the ambiguous ending, I just have a question. How does that affect sequels? I've never read the sequels to The Giver. I'm not
I
sure
didn't know there were.
There are.
I did not know that.
And I think, from what I understand, I think it kind of takes away the ambiguity.
It probably would, yeah.
So there's almost like something literary, like something poetic about an ambiguous ending. And it kind of gets ruined by a sequel. I think.
It does. Okay, so one concept is that making sure the audience is satisfied with the ending is incredibly difficult. And so one of the things Pixar has as one of their rules is ending first. It says we design and the ending first and then work from there because it's the hardest part, right? And it's the most important part. That's what defines what somebody walks away with, right? We talked about in Author's Promise, the book I was reading at the time, where I was so frustrated with the ending that, you know, I mentioned if you'd asked me 3/4 through, I said, yeah, it's a great book. Pick it up. It's really good. After I read it, I don't recommend it to anyone.
Wow.
I was so, we talked about this in Author Promise. So I really do, if you haven't heard the Author's Promise, or you're dealing with the same problems that Brian was, I recommend picking that one up because we talk about it. I'm going to go through it really quick here if you're totally unfamiliar so you're not in the dark. But there is a whole half hour on this. The Author's Promise is in the opening chapter and in the first act, you, the author, make a promise to the reader about what kind of story you're going to tell them. And that's told partly in the genre that you've chosen, but partly in the way you write that story. You're making promises. So we talked about Brandon Sanderson and this other author whose career never took off and how it's very different when you pick up their books. Brandon Sanderson, it's a world you've never been to with a magic system. You know, there's no elves and dwarves. You know, we're not in Middle Earth with a different author. We're in a whole nother world. And so we kind of expect to encounter new and different things than we're used to. And this other author had written a very traditional fantasy, and about halfway to 3/4 through the book, he completely upends everything. And the problem with that is that happens 3/4 of the way through the book instead of in the first act. If he had done that in the first act, then the readers would have known, oh, this book is going to kind of flip things on its head. And they're ready for that. Whereas if they've committed that far into the book, they wanted a classic fantasy. The author had promised one and then turned out to be something different. As you know, Brandon Sanderson's career takes off. The other guy, you never heard of him. Right? And part of it is that Brandon was fulfilling his promise so that the people who finished his book knew what they were going to get and they got it and it was satisfying. Whereas the other guy, the people who picked up his book wanted a certain kind of story and he didn't give it to them. So that's that author's promise. You've got to, in the opening of your book, you promise. I'm reading a book right now, actually, and I read the first 2 chapters, and I was kind of like, I don't even know what this book is about at this point. And I had to go and read the blurb because I was
Did
like,
that clue you in though?
The blurb? Yeah, the blurb did, but the promise of the author wasn't clear. Like, honestly, it was reading like a romance. And I was like, I know I didn't buy a romance. That's not what I do. And so the author's promise is mismatched with the genre she's writing in. And
wait, so what happened as you kept reading?
Well, I went and read the blurb, and it is a thriller. I just haven't gotten to a part where it still hasn't turned into a thriller yet. It's still reading like a romance. So, but yeah, and so her opening chapters are not giving me the promise of a thriller. I don't have anything in those chapters that's going to say action and adventure and suspense is coming. What it's telling me is this romance. And so that's a mismatch there.
It's Red Sparrow.
So, and if I hadn't gone, if I hadn't known, I knew why I had the book. I had gotten it from a friend and, so I knew that it was supposed to be a thriller. But like I said, I had to go back and look at the blurb just to make sure I was reading the right book because it didn't feel like it. Another one, we'll talk about Red Sparrow because it probably wasn't even out when we recorded that first Author's Promise. So Red Sparrow is a movie recently, and if you watch the trailers for it and you've heard of it, you probably know it's a kind of an espionage thriller. Right. I didn't see the movie, but there's a classic line from the book where they're in a class debating the end of the Cold War. And one of the students makes the comment. He says, America thinks the Cold War ended in 1988. Russia thinks it hasn't yet. and that's kind of this, the theme and the pitch of the movie. But if you read the story, it's a romance. What's at stake is not the future of the countries or potential war or bombs or anything. What's at stake is their relationship. And so if you look up...
Wait, so they're not also trying to solve a war problem?
Well, they're spies. They're getting information back and forth.
But there's not like some big Voldemort that they're trying to come...
No, and there's not like some big plot at play either. They're just spies for their governments. There's nothing... Huh. Yeah. Wow. So... like I said, the trailers pitch it as this espionage thriller, but like with James Bond, you expect something big and huge to be at stake, And that's not. What's at stake is their relationship. And so it's a romance, but it's pitched as an espionage. And if you look at the reviews and the rating on it, it did terribly. And I think that's why, is because they were promising an espionage story and they delivered a romance. And there's some overlap in those audiences, but not a lot. You sold them a bait and switch, and audiences don't like that. And that's what the author's promise is about. The promise is in your cover, it's in your title, it's in your blurb, it's in your opening chapters. And if you don't meet it, people will be disappointed. They will not be satisfied. So yes, author's promise, stick to it. One thing you'll need to ask yourself is, what questions have you raised in the book that you haven't answered yet? And this is one we've talked about before, is that in the climax, the protagonist has to make a choice that kind of is the decider of events. Jay talks about that great example from Jurassic Park. Like in Jurassic Park, you've got this problem, and that is that you want the dinosaurs to eat the villain, right? That's how Jurassic Park ends. The problem is that's the dinosaur making a choice to defeat the villain, not the hero. Yeah. And so it creates this complex issue of how do we get the protagonist to make a choice that drives the ending and still have this animal do the vanquishing, right?
Well, yeah, and there was a cool moment in Jurassic Park 2, the book, where they're underneath this vehicle, and the T-Rex or some big dinosaurs like can't get to them because they're hiding underneath, and so the protagonist she shoves the bad guy out from under the vehicle. Yeah. So she makes a choice and has power.
Right.
And then the animal, the T-Rex, does the devouring, so you get both.
So you get both.
It's a cool move.
So you need to make sure that the driver of the ending is the choice of the protagonist. They are making active choices that create that final conflict and victory. And you need to look up your genre expectations. Okay, so if you're writing romance in the happily ever after, then you need to have happily ever after at the end. Otherwise, again, the audience is going to be unsatisfied. So
if T-Rexes kill the bad guys in that story, it's not going to work.
I encountered a writer. She was writing romance, and she was writing a trilogy. And she says it started off as kind of a reverse harem. And then it was going to end up that she was just with one of the guys by the very end. And so she was facing this really big dilemma, be like, how do I approach this? My first book is clearly reverse harem, but by the end, it's just a couple. And I don't think we had a simple solution for her because, she's really setting up her audience for disappointment, because if they're buying reverse harem, that's what they want. And then if they buy the rest of the series, they might be frustrated with how that book ends because it doesn't end with what they're kind of promised in the first two books. So, like I said, we didn't have a good answer for her. There's probably an audience for that somewhere. It'd just be really hard to find them. Mm. But yeah, so you need to know your genre expectations, what it is they want. So if we had compiled that all down to one book, you'd tell her, be like, you don't sell that as reverse harem, if it was all one book instead of a trilogy, because that's not how your book ends. And that's not the feeling they're going to walk away with. Essentially, it's eliminate, not reverse harem. So, and then you'll want to catalog all your relationships, right? what are all the relationships between the characters that have interacted, and have resolutions to those. Right. Look at them and how they're connected. And, sometimes it only would take a paragraph or two. This was one of the things I was doing at the end of, the Skyfall Conspiracy is I was looking at all my characters. I had Alan, I had Vera, I had Stevenson, I had Silas, I had Donnie. And, so I was looking and Brahms would be like, okay, which of these characters have interacted to the point that they need a resolution, between them? And then I would give them, a paragraph or two at the end where either one character is just commenting about their relationship, is kind of presenting a resolution that way, or there's a short scene with them as they talk and discuss. And so that way, any of the really relevant relationships, and I discuss. So I would say like Silas and Donnie, who you meet early on, I don't put a resolution between them because their relationship never changes in the book. And so it doesn't really need to be resolved. It just is, as it was throughout the whole book. Whereas if there's been a change in that relationship, the way these characters are connected, it needs some kind of resolution, even just a paragraph or two. Okay, this is the big one. And I don't think we covered this enough when we talked about villains. The question is, do they deserve it? Right? So this is the question has the antagonist done enough harm and caused enough trouble so I feel they get what they deserve at the end? I've been reading The Wheel of Time recently, and so Balsamon is the great villain at the end. And at one point in one of the novels, Rand has a big fight with Balsamon, and then some of the other characters, they have a big fight with what's called a Black Aes Sedai. It's like an evil wizard, right? And the evil wizard had caused all kinds of trouble throughout the book and done terrible things to the characters. Whereas Balsamon is just this big evil villain who you never actually see anything. Everybody's just terrified of. So in the conflict with Rand and Balsamon, I kind of didn't care what happened.
Wow.
Because even though people are afraid of him and his name, I've never actually seen him do anything terrible to anyone. Whereas this evil wizard, they had done terrible things throughout the whole book. So while I didn't care about the Balsamon fight, I was very invested in the fight against the evil wizard. Because they had done these terrible things, I wanted them to get what they deserved. And they had done things to deserve their punishment. Whereas Balsamon, while he is talked about as the great evil, I haven't seen him do anything to deserve punishment. And so that is but this question is bigger than that. Does the protagonist deserve the reward they get? Is it big enough for the sacrifices and efforts they've made? Same with the relationships. Have they deserved the romantic relationship that develops? It's the question you need to ask for the ending, all of it. Do they deserve it?
Yeah, man, it can be really frustrating, I guess, when a couple falls in love and you're like, why are they attracted to each other? They haven't done anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, consider you on the other end of the spectrum, what is it? Mean Girls is about mean girls in high school. If the protagonist pulls out a gun and shoots the other girls to death at the end, they don't deserve that. It's too big, right? Yeah. They have to deserve what they get, but you can't go too big. Otherwise it doesn't work. So whereas at the end of, James Bond, if he pulls out a gun and shoots the villain to death, you're okay with it. He deserves it, right? He's probably killed and tortured a bunch of people throughout the movie and was planning on killing thousands, if not millions more, right? Wow. He deserves that. The mean girls don't. So that's the big question you have to ask in that reader satisfaction. Do they deserve it? And again, you ask, have I gone too big or have I gone too small? Do they, deserve more than they've gotten here?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great point.
Of course, we've got wrap it all up. So you want to conclude your story arc, that should end the story. Like in a series, you'll have arcs that will carry over. So we talk about, do they deserve it? You want to list out your characters, list out all their plots and their subplots, and make sure you cover them or set up carryovers for what you haven't resolved into other parts of your series so that you're addressing all of these components here. Some authors keep a journal of these things, and as they write them, just to make sure they've got that list to go through as they write this resolution.
So what's I've had some readers tell me that I wrapped up book 1 in my trilogy too well. They're like,
Star Child?
Yeah. It's like, it feels conclusive.
I think so. I don't. There's a few spoilers here. So I think when they destroy the Surge Gate, I think the perspective on how long that's going to take to rebuild, because they say it'll take a long time to rebuild, or they could simply choose not to rebuild it. Mm-hmm. And if it's going to take 100 years to rebuild it, or they choose not to, either way, it then becomes conclusive. That's their so that becomes their galaxy, and so it could be conclusive that way if they choose not to rebuild the gate. So
so I understand. I guess the question is, how do you balance? I want the readers to feel satisfied, but I think I made them too satisfied for a trilogy.
So,
my other book, Song of Locke, is the first in the series, and it feels very open-ended. X-Dot is the first in the series. It feels very open-ended. But this one, I made it feel like, oh, that felt good. Like, we won.
We won.
Which I wanted them to feel that. But yeah, I guess I just don't know how to balance, like, how do you give them that satisfied feeling like, oh, I liked this book, and at the same time say, there's more coming?
I think in reading some of Sanderson's work, a lot of times what he does is like everything kind of wraps up, and then he gives you one more chapter where you see the plots of the villains going forward, right?
Wait, is that like are you thinking of a specific book?
In the Mistborn, the second set, like, at the end of the first book, I actually thought the book was over, and then there was another chapter. I was like, what? And in that next chapter, you find out about a bunch of higher villains pulling strings of the lower villain that they just took care of. Yeah.
Okay. Huh.
So.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and so he just shows you, things are still happening. Things are still very much in motion. So, but he did kind of wrap everything up, and then he said, oh, and this is going on. We're part of a bigger puzzle here. So
I haven't read that series, but in Mistborn, when you finish the first book, you feel like it's over, and then I think it's not until the second book that you realize, oh, I didn't know about this massive other chunk. Like, it's way worse than anyway. Okay. So, that's basically it.
So the next principle is do not outshine the ending. Okay, so the climax needs to be the biggest, most epic moment in your story. And if on the way there you think of something even better that you put in the middle, you've got to rearrange those events. It has to be the big, epic moment.
Or they'll just feel let down.
Or they will feel let down,
That's not satisfaction.
So, again, and that's just comparing with the other things that you have put in the story. You've just got to make sure that the biggest best is at the end and not somewhere in the middle. So that's, like I said, we'll do a whole episode on each type of ending to dig in a lot deeper on these. So that was it. I hope this answers his question and anyone else who's kind of had this same thought process. How do I manage my ending so it's satisfying?
Brian, if you listen to this episode, shoot us an email and let us know what you think.
So again, a lot of it is knowing your genre, knowing your author's promise, and then a lot of it is just cataloging your characters, their plots, and then asking that big question, do they deserve it? All right. For those of you who aren't familiar with my work, we're going to pitch at you. So I write, I'm an idea writer above everything by far. I love science and I love history. And so I see history as a venue to look at ideas in a different light than you normally would. So if we talk about peer pressure and most people think that's like a teenage issue, but if you talk about peer pressure in the scope of Nazi Germany, it takes on a whole new perspective and meaning. And so I look for points in history where history itself allows us to look at an idea very differently. So the series I'm writing is about propaganda and persuasion. And I'm just looking at how manipulation tactics exist in politics and advertising and just anywhere and how they're used to manipulate people. And to look at this idea, I wanted to look at the Orson Welles War of the World's Scare and Nazi Germany propaganda techniques that led to the Holocaust. And so that's the history that I have chosen to kind of look at these things. So here is the blurb to my new book that just came out. What Makes a Nation Believe a Lie? William Stevenson is an expert in mass media persuasion and propaganda. He watched the rise of Hitler on a mountain of lies, but Stevenson also believes that the Nazis can be undone by the same power that created them, propaganda. There's just one problem. All foreign broadcasts are illegal in Germany. At best, Stevenson will have a day before the Nazi soldiers storm his radio station. It took Hitler over a decade to change the beliefs of the people. One day is not enough. Then something incredible happens. In less than an hour, the War of the Worlds broadcast convinces millions of Americans that aliens existed and the world is coming to an end. Now Stevenson races against the Nazis to discover the secrets of the Skyfall before the Third Reich uses them to gather more allies for the coming war. Some say the War of the Worlds scare never happened. Others promised it would never happen again. Dive deep into the history and science of propaganda and persuasion as this conspiracy unfolds. Take a look inside and learn what makes a nation believe a lie.
Dude, that's so good. And my favorite line is that the Nazis can be undone by the same power that created them. Propaganda. That just nails your book.
That's what my book's about.
Yeah. That's a great blurb, and it's a great book.
All right. Hit us.
Okay, so I grew up as a massive Star Wars fan, and as I became an adult, I understood, I think, why we like Empire Strikes Back so much, about kind of the depth of the character struggles in that movie. And I felt like my favorite space opera wasn't living up to what I came to value as I matured. And so I wrote this series that I feel like is scratching that itch. And it's aimed at, I mean, I wanted to keep everything that I loved about Star Wars, like the high adventure of it, the excitement and the setting, the galactic setting, but I wanted to add that deeper character and that more thoughtful element. So the trilogy is called Star Child, and I'll read you the blurb for the first book. Tyranny rules the galaxy. President Tyberos controls the interstellar gates, regulates the media, and monitors the civilians. Like the grip of his cybernetic hand, he maintains a relentless hold on the populace, keeping anyone else from gaining too much power. And the power he hates most of all is the magic of the song, a force so strong it flows out as light from the eyes. His witch hunters kidnap and torment anyone with such abilities, and the people are afraid to fight back, afraid to stand together, afraid to rise up. Still, a planet named Solace is poised to counter these fears and strike against the tyranny. One person holds the key to calling its citizens to arms. She is a Radiance named Colette, but she too has been kidnapped and is being held prisoner in the infamous depths of Building 13. Only the most daring rescue might save her, and the consequence of failure is death. Yet a small team of rebels dare to try. Their mission requires a bloody wing, a priceless alien artifact with the power to travel outside the interstellar gates, off the grid, beyond regulations and the grip of the witch hunters. So the rebels enlist a man who stole one of these ships from Tyberos himself, a renegade pilot named Star Child. There we go.
So those are our pitches. All right, thanks for listening, and tell your friends about the show. Put up a Twitter list. People love those for some reason, and put us on it. That's the best way you can tell people about the show, it seems like. So yeah, let your writing groups know if you enjoy this and if it helps improve your writing as you go about it, and leave us a review. We are a fairly big podcast. I was doing some research recently, and I think we barely make the top 10% of all podcasts.
Nice.
And we have like 2 reviews. So if you've published a book, you know how important they are and how hard they are to get. So leave us one. And if you haven't published, and you will know the pain. So, all right. Thanks for listening.